Welcome back to Open Line tonight. I got a cough during the break, so hopefully it won't break out right now. But we're talking about gun safes and gun safety tonight. My two folks joining us, Senator Kerry Roberts and John Harris, the Executive Director of the Tennessee Firearm Association. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having
Been
us.
a lively conversation so far. I do want to spread some education if we can. We are also streaming live on the NewsChannel 5 Facebook page. A lot of folks talking about background checks. And I know, John, you can set the record straight, clear it up. Let's talk about buying a weapon. What happens first?
Okay. If you're purchasing a firearm, ever since 1968, we've had the Gun Control Act at the federal level. And it regulates purchasers made through licensed dealers, your retail stores. And in order to purchase since November of '98, we're under what's called the Tennessee Instant Check system. And you have to go in, you have to show identification. You fill out what's called a Form 4473, which is a multi-page form that asks, where do you live, where were you born, how old are you, what's your social, asks you a bunch of questions about your history, your mental health. It's a broad spectrum of questions. And all of the questions, the content's regulated by federal law. And once you fill out that form, then the dealer calls or contacts TBI either on the phone or through a computer, runs your name against all available computerized records. And as a general rule, TBI will respond to that within 3 to 5 minutes.
Wow.
Way over 90% of the time, 3 to 5 minutes they can respond. And if all the questions are answered correctly, and they're not always the case, some people tell the truth, and if TBI clears you, then you can pass the background check almost instantly and walk out with it. Now, we've had that law 20 years, and it does what it's supposed to do. But by the same token, you need to know that Tennessee is reporting, TBI, that we're having about 500,000 of those kind of transactions a year statewide.
Wow. That's a lot.
So there's a lot of guns being bought in Tennessee. Now, that only applies to if you go in and buy it from a dealer. So the other type of sale, and this is a matter, again, of federal law that Tennessee doesn't deviate from, is called a casual sale. And what it basically says is if you're making an occasional purchase or an occasional sale, if you own a gun, you know, if I've got one of mine and Kerry decides he wants to buy it because he's going dove hunting this weekend, he doesn't have to go to a dealer to buy it. Now, if I know that he's got a prohibiting characteristic, if he's too old, too young, if he's got a, you know, if I know he has a problem, I can't legally sell it to him. That violates federal and state law. The difference is I don't have to call TBI. And as a matter of fact, TBI won't even take my phone call. There's no way to call and make the background check. If you insisted on it as a private person sale, really your only option is to go find some gun dealer that will let you run it through their books, and then you pay an extra fee because it costs them money and time to do it.
Yeah. So on that part of it, from your experience, from the position you sit on, what can be better about that?
I don't think we really ought to mess with it because it's a balance between regulating transactions only because of the Commerce Clause. That's the only reason Congress can even regulate it in the first place. And recognizing the fact, like I said, since '68, for 50 years now, that there are some sales that happen at a low enough volume between individuals that, as sort of a balancing of public policies, we're not going to require them to go through background checks. Now, if I sell it through a casual sale and I know that the person I'm selling it to has a felony conviction, I've committed a federal felony that's punishable by up to 5 years, and I can be prosecuted at the state level. So just a lot of people aren't going to take that chance.
Yeah.
And that's not where you see the problem. More frequently, the problem is the stolen gun.
Yes.
And background check doesn't affect that at all.
No, not at all. And that's maybe perhaps where the gun safes come back into play. Let's also talk about getting that that carry permit. What happens there? The
carry permit background check's an entirely different process. It's basically the same set of questions, but the legislature added on additional factors. So you may be eligible to own a gun, but you might not be able to get a permit. And there are factors like, for example, if you've had multiple DUIs within a certain time frame, or if you've been voluntarily admitted to a mental health facility and it hadn't been outside this window of time that they've defined, then you could legally own the gun, but you can't carry it. Now, that background check is done by the Department of Safety as opposed to TBI, and they've got up to 90 days to do it. And it's a lot more thorough background check because they take fingerprints, they send those in to TBI, which then processes them through FBI, and any fingerprint-based check is a lot more accurate than just the call-in off the social.
Gotcha. Okay, let's jump back to the phones. We have Phyllis, who's been waiting ever so patiently. Phyllis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. He seems very thorough on a lot of points, but I still think that there are children out there that need more attention, student counselors, and it could happen in a gym teacher, a history teacher, any nurse, maybe a nurse at the school could pick up on these points. And these kids, you know, that are hurting inside, they just seem to be falling through the system, and I think we need to monitor the net a little more closely. Somebody needs to, before they even have a chance to think about acquiring a gun. I don't know if it involves the FBI but we definitely need some student counselors to step up. Gym teachers, student teachers, nurses, and you know, pay attention to these hurting youngsters.
Phyllis, I hear what you're saying, because I think it's a frustration that many of us feel right now, especially with this latest shooting and what we're learning about this shooter. You know, the sheriff's office is at his home 39 times in the past couple of years. The Department of Family and Services had been there. He had bought numerous guns legally in the past year. You know, a tip had been called into the FBI about him, a specific tip that said, I think he's going to commit a school shooting, 42 days before he did. All of it did nothing to prevent this. And I think that everyone's frustrated saying, you know, it's got to get rid of the guns, got to get rid of the AR-15s, got to do this, got to do that. And it's like, but here we sit. Where do you guys, what are you leaning towards at this point?
Well, I find, you know, when you see a tragedy like this, you see so many errors that were made along the way that could have stopped it. You know, just, we say all the time, see something, say something. But nobody did anything.
Well,
you know,
and a lot of people spoke up.
A lot of people spoke up, but yet this unfolded because ultimately people stopped short of taking any action that they could have taken, and it's just a terrible tragedy. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that in this young man's case, the terrible thing that he did is really symptomatic of, you know, the mental illness or maybe just the evil in his heart. And one of the things that I hope that when we see these tragedies that we give a lot of thought to is, how do we reach people who, we have people who love other people don't do these things, right? So people who have love in their heart and they live by the golden rule, or those people who are religious, who know that the first command is to love God and the second command is to love, you know, your neighbor as yourself, they don't do things like this. And so we've got to find a way as a society to take the responsibility. And I sat down with one of my children today, and I said, you know, when we talk about society taking responsibility for how we view other people, how we treat other people, we often want to talk about what other people need to do. And I asked my son, I said, what do we need to do as a family? You know, we don't think we have a problem with you know, this. I mean, to my knowledge, my kids have never hated anybody else or expressed hatred. But I said, you know, we don't need to talk about what other people need to do. We need to do something in our own home so that we just reinforce this idea that we have love and compassion for other people, because if you have that, you would never do such a thing.
It's a wonderful point, and perhaps a good talking point for a lot of families watching tonight. They could say that over the dinner table and have that discussion. John, I know that you have heard every gun control argument out there and then some, I'm sure.
Most of them.
Yes. How do you respond to situations like this when people start, you know, really attacking, you know, the NRA and gun control, and what do we need to do when you get these things off the street? What's your response?
It's an interesting problem, and I've been doing this now separate from my law practice, I've been doing the executive director stuff for 23 years. And it is not uncommon that we see these mass public shootings.
Yeah.
It is very predictable that when you have one, there's almost always in the past been a direct connection to mental health issues and a history of mental health.
Yeah.
Now, it's changed a little bit somewhat, and there may be a nuance between a mental health issue and what we had in Chattanooga, because you could argue that the terrorist is a mental health example, but
Sure.
there may be a slight, but mental health is almost always an element. It's like Senator Roberts said, there's something wrong with that person
Sure.
to do this kind of thing. And one thing that we have seen as this issue's come up over the years in Tennessee and the legislature is defining what it is within the mental health umbrella that is a predictor so that we can say that person shouldn't have a gun is almost impossible. And here's why. Mental health professionals don't want to play the game, in part. I've heard lots of excuses. One of the most common is if they're forced to disclose the health status of their patients or people seeking counseling, they're concerned that people won't come get counseling. I know that to be the fact because I've represented veterans who don't want to go to the VA because their guns will be taken away.
Yeah.
And so we've looked for ways that they can get VA benefits on a physical issue as opposed to a mental health. The second problem is if you're in a car wreck and you have a broken leg, it heals and you can have a point of injury and a point of healing and you're better. Mental health isn't that way. The way we define it, if you have an acute episode of depression because your child or your spouse suddenly died, you've got a mental health diagnosis. Well, when are you better?
Yeah.
Who's going to certify it? Who's going to say they can have a gun again? And that's a huge problem because we don't differentiate between mental health that is benign, they think they're Superman, but they really don't do anything beyond have that delusion, and someone who's potentially violent. The next problem with that analysis is mental health is an evolving issue. So you may be perfectly okay for a long time and then go nuts.
Right.
Well, not the best way to put it, but it just suddenly manifests itself,
Yes.
like what may have happened, not so much with this kid because he had a history, but
in other ways. And what I'm hearing is so many people want to make the answers, the argument black and white, and there is so much gray.
Right.
There is so much gray to figure out and just wade through and weed through, and it gets muddy in there, and that makes it hard. Yeah.
Well, and it's really hard to find pragmatic solutions because we live, whether we like it or not, we live in a society where we have probably more guns than people in America. Would that be about right?
in Tennessee we have more guns than we do people.
Yeah. So, you know, short of a gun confiscation, you know, you really, when people talk about gun control, I mean, the thing that I've learned as a legislator is, number one is the people that we don't have problems with are the people who will abide by the law and do whatever you tell them to. Those people are not the problem. It's the people that ignore the law.
The law anyway.
Yeah, that's number one. Then number two is you have more guns than you have, you know, Tennesseans, and almost as many guns as you have as Americans. And so you have to think practically, what can you do about that? And that's not even delving into the constitutional issue and whether that's an inalienable right or not. That's just pure pragmatism. What do you do when you have that many guns?
Yeah.
And the fact is that if you tried to somehow prohibit them, every time the government tries to prohibit something, it gives rise to a black market,
Sure does.
which obvious is, you know, is very problematic in its own right, and often more dangerous. So,
Okay, we're going to take another quick break, and we will be right back with more of your calls and questions. Stick around.